This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you haven't heard already, I run a podcast called The Deprogram with Hakeem and Yugopnik. We tackle all sorts of topics, from theory to current events to culture, and just generally have a good time. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, check out The Deprogram by following any of the links below. Global collapse is here. Our summers are longer, hotter, and deadlier. Floods, hurricanes, and wildfires have not only become increasingly common, but more intense. The oceans are rising, and thousands of species are going extinct. Millions of people will need to abandon the place they called home, and many have already started. We are living through the climate catastrophe, but it's not too late to act, and we already know how. Earlier this year, the UN published this report on crises and climate change. In a document with the catchy name Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction 2022, more specifically in this companion paper, the UN uses a sentence it's never used before to describe what lies ahead for humanity: total societal collapse. After considering 4 potential scenarios, the UN finds that in 3 of them, humanity will face an increase in global catastrophes, with only one scenario staving off the worst that climate change will produce. One scenario keeps us relatively safe, 3 lead us down a very dark path. In no uncertain terms, collapse, droughts, famines, poverty, disease. These will all become permanent and widespread features of human existence provided that we do not act to remain within our planetary boundaries. And this report makes it clear that without immediate, decisive efforts, the feedback loops and codependencies between our climate and our politics will plunge the world into some dark and increasingly difficult to escape times. But okay, who cares? We've heard this a million times before. Yeah, some fish and bugs are dying. Yeah, it's getting hotter. It's getting harder to grow crops some places. So what? What's the bottom line here? I think it's important to look at this situation from a more human perspective. We've been told for years that we're on track for disaster. We've been given mountains of evidence, scores of scientific reports, and scientists all around the world are united in the same effort. But what gets lost in all this is how it affects us. Normal people in our everyday lives. Like, intellectually, I know that losing pollinating insects is bad, but is it something I think about in my daily life? Not really. What's really driven the problem home for me is watching people's totally unprofessional phone footage. I can watch 100 news pieces about rising sea levels with flashy graphics showing the coastline of Florida, but it doesn't really click until I see someone showing their home being destroyed. Someone with no video training, no agenda, just a person who is watching a lifetime of memories being ruined and sharing it on the internet because they don't know what else to do. That's what collapse looks like in the 21st century. Watching countless cell phone videos of death and destruction creeping closer and closer until one day, you're the one filming. It's hearing about a climate scientist lighting himself on fire in a desperate bid to get those in power to listen. For people like me, it's going to shoot a documentary in the Marshall Islands and seeing firsthand the waves knocking on the doors of people whose families have lived there for generations. Every single one of those people will have to leave. They'll have to uproot their entire life, escape to some foreign country, and watch their homeland sink into the sea. This will affect all of us. Some sooner than others, like the inhabitants of the Marshall Islands and countless other low-lying islands and coastlines. At some point, we will watch everything we care about be reclaimed by nature, or scorched beyond repair, or swept off the map by the next record-breaking storm. Even if you think climate change is perfectly natural, despite decades of research, much of which was actively hidden from the public by fossil fuel companies, why would you just wait and let it destroy your community? If you're out for a walk and a car is bearing down on you, and you're clearly going to be run over, does it really matter whether the driver is intentionally trying to hit you or if his brakes are out? Of course not. Your response should be the same in either case. You step out of the way. So, how do we step out of the way? So far, the plan looks like this.
I often note and have talked with many of you about our shared belief that our world is increasingly more interconnected and interdependent. That is especially true when it comes to the climate crisis, which is why we will work together and continue to work together to address these issues, to tackle these challenges, and to work together as we continue to work operating from the new norms, rules, and agreements that we will convene to work together on, to galvanize global action. With that, I thank you all. This is a matter of urgent priority for all of us, and I know we will work on this together.
Okay, why don't we actually look at our options? The first thing that's been proposed for years to slow or even halt the advance of climate change is the idea of green growth. From the World Bank to the Green New Deal, many governments and international organizations around the world have argued that our first priority in preventing the worst effects of climate change is to make capitalism go green. At the core of these proposals is the transition to renewable energies and the idea that, while a lot needs to change in how we produce our electricity, very little needs to fundamentally change with how our society organizes production and consumption writ large. In other words, we don't need to sacrifice growth, overproduction, overconsumption, or anything else so long as we simply make things sustainable and renewable. It's a project that plenty of banks and investment firms have latched onto as well, with the creation of environmental, social, and corporate governance, or ESG funds in the past 20 years. Portfolios of companies to invest in that, among other things, offer a green alternative to traditional investments while also delivering consistent profits to investors. The overall message of all these measures is that, so long as we make the right things profitable, we will get out of the climate change trap and come out, if not unscathed, at least safe. It's a win-win. It's growth without any of the moral hangups of environmental exploitation, or the pollution of production and consumption. And while it might sound great to some, green growth is a lie. We cannot keep growing our economy year after year and also rein in climate change. One of them will need to give. Here's why. First, a little bit about growth. Our economy is based on the promise of growth. Every quarter, capitalist firms must deliver more to their investors than they did last quarter. Same with national GDP. Every company everywhere, and every country too, under capitalism, has to do the same thing: grow exponentially or start suffering the consequences. Companies that don't grow when their competitors do, die. But growth isn't magical. At the scale of an entire country's economy, for the whole thing to grow, there must necessarily be a ramp-up in production. You can't just increase consumption, which is the way we measure growth, without producing more in some way or another. So we do. We produce more. More things, more energy, more waste. More production entails more extraction, transportation, carbon emissions, trash, and so on. We take more things out of the ground, move more things around, and throw more things away. It's what makes the numbers on the graph go up. But on a planet with finite resources, this kind of system doesn't work. We can't keep pulling more from the Earth year after year and not expect there to be a point when that's no longer an option. We can either plan for it, or we will be forced to reckon with it at the worst possible time, and then it'll be too late. And while green growth promises us this can change, that we can continue this project of growth without increasing extraction and production, there is empirical evidence that we cannot. In an analysis of multiple green growth models, 2 economists have found that even in the best case scenario, the idea of green growth does not work. That's considering any prediction model, no matter how optimistic. In their paper, Hickel and Kallis find that extant empirical evidence does not support the theory of green growth, or more precisely, that there is no evidence that we can have sustainability and growth at the same time, at least as we're first transitioning. All the economic, environmental models they look at only work when GDP growth approaches 0, or in other words, when growth is factored out of the equation. The problem is not that it's theoretically impossible to make our economy sustainable or founded on renewable energy. We can do all that and continue to live very fulfilling lives without needing our standards of living to drop. The problem is that it's not going to be profitable or quick enough by any metric, even the most optimistic of estimates. While it might be a successful model someday, green growth won't work in time. The problem is that while it's possible to transition to 100% renewable energy, we cannot do it fast enough to stay under 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius if we continue to grow the global economy at existing rates. Again, more growth means more energy demand, and more energy demand makes it all the more difficult, impossible in fact, to generate enough renewable capacity to meet it. We can't grow and transition to renewables fast enough to match that growth. It's already hard enough to have it meet our current demands, and the time frame isn't working in our favor, even when we're generous with our estimates. Then there's the fact that this approach isn't working as expected right now. Those ESG funds I mentioned earlier, the funds that offer green investment alternatives, they're not always profitable, and oftentimes less profitable than their fossil-dependent counterparts. If our goal is to wait for the market to make the best, most sustainable option also become the most profitable, we will be waiting a long time. Too long. But we don't need to get into the technical or scientific breakdowns of individual green growth models to see how this general approach is wrong. Even if we assume that Hickel and Kallis' analysis is completely incorrect, and that the green growth models they criticize actually do get it right, and in time to prevent 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, there is a much greater obstacle in our way: power. The oil and gas industry is the most capitalized industry in the world. Simply put, that means that oil and gas is where the most money is. More money is concentrated in fossil fuels than in all of retail, or all of banking, or all of the tech sector. The total capitalization of the oil and gas industry is equivalent to $6.7 trillion. If we think of global capitalism as the arena where competition between industries happens, then this is a competition where fossil fuels have the best hand. Fossil fuels have the most money, and therefore the most power. In concrete terms, that means the oil and gas industry has the ability to prevent almost any sort of action that would hurt its interests. While we can theorize about green growth models and what happens if we transition to renewables at this or that rate, with this or that expected level of growth, the fossil fuel industry can prevent all of it from happening. It can sabotage like no other industry can. At the government level, fossil fuels have been lining the pockets of politicians for years, with prominent figures like Joe Manchin receiving millions of dollars from the coal industry to block the passage of even the most lukewarm anti-emission plans. In the media, fossil fuel companies have been discrediting climate change science for decades, with advertisements and fossil-friendly journalists obscuring the evidence or trying to spin attention away, like in this horrifying clip from this summer.
On a serious note, folks, by early next week, you can scrap 20 degrees, it could well be 40 degrees. I think there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of excess deaths early next week. The charts that I can see in front of me are frightening. So we all like nice weather, but this will not be nice weather. This will be potentially lethal weather for a couple of days. It'll be brief, but it'll be brutal.
So, John,
we can
So, John, I want us to be happy about the weather and every single. I don't know whether something's happened to meteorologists to make you all a little bit fatalistic and harbingers of doom, because all of the broadcasts, particularly on the BBC, every time I've turned on, anyone's talking about the weather, they're saying that there's going to be tons of fatalities. But haven't we always had hot weather?
More recently, fossil fuel companies have switched to presenting climate change as though it's a problem of individual consumption, like in a series of BP ads I covered in this video, rather than an economy-wide problem in the way we organize production. Fossil fuel companies have also worked for decades to bury renewable energy production and alternative ways to consume energy. They've tried to kill electric cars, an alternative that only ever offered a minuscule environmental benefit compared to gas-powered cars, but nonetheless threatens fossil fuels' commanding market share. Our entire social reproduction is happening under the ruling hand of fossil fuels. The way our society produces, consumes, and then justifies these practices in legal and cultural texts is heavily directed by fossil fuels and their interests. They decide what gets made, how it's advertised, how it's regulated, and at the end of the day, how we're meant to feel about it. Even if we could get all the green growth models to work in theory, if we could make our energy use optimally efficient, or even give up on the idea of growth entirely, our transition to a sustainable economy will not happen with fossil fuel interests standing in the way. So long as they are committed to being the most powerful player in the global economy, whether that's a growing economy or not, they will prevent change from happening. And what's terrifying is that their power will likely only grow over time as fossil fuels become more scarce and we are still trapped on their sinking ship. While we've been told that the coming scarcity of oil will push us into renewable energy sooner, scarcity is the name of the capitalist game. You can't make money when something's abundant. It's when it's scarce that the big bucks come in. The more our global oil reserves slowly dwindle, or the more we place restrictions on how much we allow to be extracted without directly controlling prices, the more valuable that oil becomes, and the more profits can be extracted from its sale. Look no further than what is happening right now. 2022 has been a year of record profits for oil and gas companies. To take a specific example, one French fossil fuel company, Total Energy, saw bigger earnings this year than any other company has in the entire history of the French economy. What all this means is that a small handful of people, led by the sole motivation to deliver greater profits than their competitors year after year, are making decisions that benefit their interests over those of the rest of humanity. They are fiercely clinging to their profits at the expense of our collective survival. The solution is obvious. We need an economic model that is democratic, that takes power away from the unaccountable few and returns it to the many. While many people tend to think of capitalism and democracy as synonyms, the case of what to do about climate change is a great example of why equating these two terms is misguided. Given the power to decide what to do about climate change, everyday people make vastly different decisions from corporations. As we've all seen, corporations choose profits and more extraction. But what about people? In a 2014 experiment, researchers at Harvard and Yale tasked people with the responsibility of managing collective resources among themselves and for future generations. The expectation was that if capitalism is a true reflection of democracy and the natural tendency of humans, this study group would essentially arrive at the same conclusion as our modern capitalist economy. They would deplete their resources and screw over future generations in favor of immediate profits. After all, we're often told that it's human nature to be greedy, or that when resources are not privately owned, they succumb to the so-called tragedy of the commons. Everybody acts selfishly to the point of exhausting common resources. Since each individual has more to gain by acting selfishly than by making sure the common good is preserved for everyone, the philosophical experiment always ends with people ruining it for each other and is used to justify splitting up common goods into private hands. But like many experiments before it, the Harvard and Yale study found that the opposite is true. Researchers found that, on average, a full 68% of individuals chose to use their share sustainably, taking only as much as the pool could regenerate, sacrificing possible profits so that future generations could thrive. In other words, the majority of people behave exactly the opposite of how economic theory predicts. More interestingly, when people were put in a democratic conversation about how to organize these resources as a group, since the overwhelming majority prioritized sustainability over profits, the group went forward with a strategy that would preserve their limited resources in perpetuity. They gave up profits. In other words, democracy works to combat climate change because when we're not broken up into little profit-maximizing machines, we make decisions that truly are better for everyone. And you don't have to trust this study by Harvard and Yale researchers if you don't want to. We've seen real-world examples of the same thing. Back in 2019, in response to the Yellow Vest protests, the French government gave everyday people a chance to exercise their democratic power. The government selected a group of 150 people completely randomly from all of France and tasked them with planning a 40% decrease in carbon emissions by 2030. Over the course of only 8 weekends, everyday people like you and me, not scientists, not academics, not politicians, people as young as 16 and as old as 80, more representative of the class, gender, and age makeup of the general population than the French Congress, all heard from experts, debated amongst themselves, and found ways to protect the environment. Not only that, they knew that after they were done, their propositions would be submitted to a national referendum, and if successful, would become actual law. It was a daunting task, and they weren't given very much time. But normal citizens stepped up and got to work. Like in the Harvard-Yale experiment, the assembly chose sustainability. They proposed banning all advertisements for the most polluting products like cars or plane rides, banning single-use plastic by 2023, banning internal flights of less than 4 hours in favor of trains, ending planned obsolescence, making recycling mandatory for all plastic products, transitioning away from trucks as a means of transporting goods, making landlords renovate all buildings to be energy efficient by 2040, enforcing high taxes for polluting industries, and many, many more radical propositions in a list of about 150, which were noted in a publicly accessible 460-page document. So, what happened? Did France suddenly become a paradise of eco-utopianism? No. Within the first few sessions of the Assembly, its members realized that in order to achieve the kinds of measures that were necessary to prevent the most adverse climate change consequences, they would need to hurt industrial profits. It was clear that capitalism was not compatible with this project. But people were willing to compromise some profits and some production for continued survivability. They made difficult decisions knowing it would mean a chance to continue living on a planet suited for human needs. They recognized the need for radicality, and in many ways, they embraced it. But of course, this didn't go over well with the government. Immediately, the neoliberal French president and his ministers descended on the assembly. In a series of speeches trying to divert the democratic process, France's politicians tried to get the assembly to be reasonable and not get too many crazy ideas, telling them there's no such thing as, quote, magic money, and other such claims intended to pacify their radical ambitions. Still, the assembly stayed the course and demanded change. But since messing with the assembly wasn't enough, Macron opted for outright denial. The referendum that was meant to take place at the end of the 8 weeks never did. In fact, most of the policies proposed by the assembly were either heavily watered down, or in a few instances, outright vetoed, as was the case for a proposed 4% tax on companies making more than 10 million euros to finance these projects. In stark contrast to the government's refusal, a national poll found that a majority of French people would have supported most measures. What this case shows is that people are ready for change, and they're ready to make difficult decisions. Capitalists aren't. What's it going to be? A brutal, dystopian, unlivable future for the majority of humanity, all so a few executives can keep their profits, or a brighter, fairer, sustainable future for us and for our children. A world where human flourishing matters more than the blood-soaked dollars in corporate bank accounts. Let's decide for ourselves, or we might lose the chance. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. Thanks to viewers like you, I've not only been able to keep up my weekly videos, but also sustain a podcast with 2 other great YouTubers. Hakeem Ugopnik and I started the Deprogram because there was a real lack of a truly international socialist podcast. And what better way to fix that than having 3 socialists from 3 different parts of the world come together to discuss our unique perspectives on important topics. That, and it's just fun to hang out and talk commie stuff for an hour or so each week. We're approaching the 50 episode mark, so you have plenty of fun topics to choose from, like how to win people over to the left, the failures of past socialist experiments, and of course, debunking some of the most common anti-communist talking points. We've also had some great guests, including Richard Wolff and Brendan James from Blowback. If you'd like to help support the podcast, join our Discord, and get early access to every episode, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thedeprogram. Otherwise, you can catch 1 episode per week absolutely free on all your favorite podcast platforms, or right here on YouTube. So check out the Deprogram by following any of the links below. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous content by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.